Hello, I'm Tom Hollingsworth, and welcome to Networking Field Day. We are here in Palo Alto, California, with our friends from Apstra. We are going to be listening in about their new product and solution, and we have around the table a group of Networking Field Day delegates. They represent the best and brightest podcasters, speakers, writers, and influencers in the community. They are going to be asking questions, making comments, and offering their opinions as part of an invited panel. If you would like to learn more about this event, including how to become one of these delegates or a presenter, please go to our website at techfieldday.com. You can also find more videos like this about a variety of technical subjects at our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/techfieldday.
So the question is, we talked about, it's checking the network against what it expects the state should be, and that expectation has to come from somewhere. And that's really what we're going to show you next. He's going to tear it down, and we're going to walk you through the process of describing the network, so that the AOS, the Apstra Operating System, can build those expectations, and it knows what to look for to make sure, so they can do all the things like the vendor swap, right, without touching the CLI or anything. And this is a problem where, again, it's a really big problem, and you have to break it into pieces. And the vendor swap, I think, is a really important marker for a tool that claims to automate networking. And the reason is that, in my experience, looking back in my career, and this is not something that really occurred to me, I never thought about this until I came here, your choice of vendor and switch model is almost always made at the time that you're designing the network. And it becomes part of your standard. And that kind of makes it hard to be fluid with your vendor and your switch models, right? If you're choosing the switch model, this is my very fancy diagram for this portion of you're welcome. If you're choosing the switch vendor at the, when you're designing the network, then are you really automating the network? And the answer, is the tool really automating the network? And the answer is, it is not. So the first thing you have to do is decouple this choice, the switch choice, from the design process. Decoupled. So
it's amazing.
Brilliant. Game changer. Think about this for a second. When we're sitting down and we're thinking about, okay, we have to build this out. There's some new applications coming in. You have an existing network, and you're going to build out an L3 clause to attach a whole bunch of servers, or whatever it is you're going to do. You don't start off right away, pulling in Visio icons for Cisco switches and immediately draw it up in your mind. Before you even get to that point, you have this notion of network nodes with lines between them representing how things are going to be connected. Like so. And these network nodes are just generically represent an Ethernet switch, right? There's no implied, in your mind when you're thinking about this at that moment, there's no implied vendor, right? It's just, okay, I'm going to build a network that looks like this. Like, these are Ethernet switches, these are my uplinks, so many servers will be attached underneath, right? That's what you're thinking in your mind. And it's after this point, currently, that we start thinking immediately, if you're the network designer, okay, now which switches am I going to choose and all that stuff. And then not only do you choose the switches, but it goes farther than that, right? I mean, you even have configurations that you draw for those switches, right? And that all becomes part of your sort of standard operating procedure. Unless you're totally winging it every time you put a switch in, right? I mean, the network architect he's controlling everything, right? The network designer is controlling everything. Not just the topology, not just the design, but all the way down to the switches, all the way down to the configs. And then everyone else, your sort of tier 2 engineers, your deployment or implementation engineers, and then your network operations team, they're all just following those instructions more or less. So how do we decouple it? Then how do we really do that? Well, there's two things. You have to start thinking of these two things, network design and switch choice, as two separate processes, right? You can be evaluating switches that you want, as long as, with AOS, as long as the switches are supported in our hardware compatibility list, which Jeremy will pull up
Sure. Yeah,
right now.
Yeah.
There's 26 some vendors that we, models that we support with different versions of OS. As long as it's in that list, you can grab that and you can evaluate it, and then you can, build this generic port representation for that switch and add it to your inventory of available switches that you can use later on at the time you're deploying. So the choice of vendor becomes a point-in-time decision at implementation time, not design time. So people will reuse this generic design when they're building stuff out, and then they'll use whatever's cheapest or whatever's popular, right? At the moment they're making that choice, they can choose whatever's available there. And by the way, this list is extensible by the user. This is in version 1.0. Within some constraints, you can actually add platforms to this list, so you're not constrained.
Don't a lot of times, though, the network design kind of inform which switch choice you're going to go with?
Well,
How do you kind of get around that?
if you're just building an L3 clause, how many different models can you build an L3 clause with? As long as it meets your bandwidth requirements, right? That's what you're designing when you're designing a network. You have so many servers, so many uplinks. You're balancing that out to meet some requirements, and as long as a model can be plugged into one of those, any model can be plugged into one of those roles, as long as it meets those requirements, right? So if that's all you're building is an L3 clause, then not strictly speaking, no. You can use whatever's available. That's the idea. This is another thing too. When we talk about vendor agnosticism, there is this sort of push and pull thing, right? We don't want people to always make snowflake networks, right? And we bitch about this all the time in the industry. People build the network they think they really need, but they really didn't need the network they built, right? They just got it in their heads. And part of the reason is, when you go through the design process and you're trying to build this out, what is all the work you have to do? If someone says, I want this to be multi-vendor, now you got to go on the websites, multiple vendor websites, and you have to figure out what models are going to work, and does the network operating system have the right features, and then eventually, you're going to get a hold of someone at a couple or more vendors that you have interest in. And it's not like, the sales team or whoever comes back to you, they don't come in with like a Burger King hat and with the idea that you're going to have your way. It doesn't work like that, right? They know right now that switch choice is tightly coupled with your design, and they want to make sure that the architect chooses them. So going forward, there is no choice. Like, they depend on that. So we have, we have to sort of get away from that. And part of the way they solidify your choice in them is to encourage you to use proprietary features that you probably don't need and probably make your network more complicated. So in our minds, the first step is, again, if you want to decouple that switch choice from the network design, you have to think of these as two separate processes. You can add, you know what sort of topologies you want to build, and you're evaluating switches that can operate in those topologies, that you can build those topologies with, separate from the actual design process. So we're actually going to show that here. We're actually going to build some modeling around different switches that we'll add, make available for designs, and then we'll go through the process of actually doing a design. And then after that, we'll actually implement, and we'll see how at the time of implementation, because we've pre-validated these models will work with the topologies we want to deploy, that we can wait until the time of implementation to make that decision.